Welcome to round two of the Menorca Open. For what's probably pretty obvious reasons, considering the opponent, this was a very, very special game for me, despite the result. Playing in Europe, obviously, part of the goal is to gain rating, play for norms, play for titles, because that's notoriously much easier to do in Europe than it is in the US. The whole rating system, title system especially, is designed around people playing in Europe, very much penalizes people who play in the US. So that's obviously like sort of the primary purpose of going to these tournaments, but part of the reason that I like playing in these events, and especially these larger prestigious opens that attract a lot of top players, is because it gives you the opportunity to play against people that you've kind of, idolized. I wouldn't say idolized, but maybe like these sort of like mythological figures almost that you grow up studying. When you look at like openings or you look at like the development of even endgame theory, like whatever from back in the day when I was growing up, the very, very common approach would be, okay, if you want to know like what you're supposed to do in the Dragon variation or the Nimzo Indian, whatever, is you find a top player who plays it, somebody in like the, I don't know, 26, 2700 range, and you look at what they're doing and they develop the theory. When you look at top tournaments, you're looking at these very, very top players. Like these are the games that you're studying to get better as a chess player. And so the names that you associate with them kind of elevate very much in your mind to these almost abstract concepts. Like they kind of transcend being a player themselves, and they're just sort of like associated with this class of chess. Nowadays, obviously, I have that effect a little bit less now. I've played a lot of 2600, 2700 level players in my career. And as you play them and as you talk to them, especially outside of chess, like, they're just human beings too. They like sports, they like types of food, like whatever. They're just like normal people. And so mostly when I play like 2600, 2700 level players, it's just kind of whatever. But there are still certain players that when you're actually sitting across the board from them, it feels like a very surreal experience that is really, really cool to have, especially since it's so rare these days. And Ivanchuk is a player who clearly needs no introduction and very much falls into that category of players that there's something special about being able to just sit across the board from them, let alone, actually be playing a serious game. So I was very happy to get this pairing. Obviously, it's a bit past Ivanchuk's prime. He's still a very, very, very strong player, but it's a good opportunity to play against somebody who, is very, very strong, with somebody that you can make a result against. Like, I wasn't coming in thinking, oh, I'm just, like, completely, like, this is one of the biggest mismatches of all time, which it probably is. But if I'm going to be playing a top player, like, this is one of my better chances to score. So I was pretty happy with the pairing. What I didn't know going into this game is, how do you prepare for a player like this? Like I said, I've played against a lot of 2600, 2700 level players, but somebody like Ivanchuk is a completely different beast, where they've played, every opening under the sun for many, many, many years. They, it's one of these players who, like, they've forgotten, like, far more about theory than I will probably ever learn. So he basically gets to decide, like, whatever opening he wants to play, he's gonna know it better than I do. Like there's no opportunity for me to say my preparation is probably going to be better than his. And so I didn't actually put any a ton of specific preparation to this game. I mean, I glanced at stuff a little bit, but I knew that he could play basically any first move. He could play e4, he could play d4, he could play c4, he can play knight f3, whatever he was feeling like for that game. And I also knew that he does a lot of preparation on his own, even now, in these open tournaments for specific opponents. So I was kind of curious to see what a player of Ivanchuk's stature and experience and preparation, like seeing my repertoire and my games over the last few years, like what it was that he would come up with to try to punish me in the opening, which turned out to be, I guess it turned out to be a little bit of a good idea to not have done much preparation, because Ivanchuk decided to come up with one f4, which I don't think I've ever faced in a serious game, or at least not in a very long time. So my interpretation of this was, well, a very generous interpretation, and one that I'm going to choose to believe a little bit because I have an ego, is that Ivanchuk spent like hours and hours looking at my repertoire, and he was like, damn, like this guy's so good at openings. Like there's no way I can beat him in a main line. I've got to do something like really weird. Obviously, the explanation is probably just he was bored and felt like playing f4 and knew that I'm pretty bad, so he beat me anyway. But we're gonna go with the for the former one because that sounds better. But so Ivanchuk started with f4, and then I needed to decide. Okay, well, maybe he's seen like some online games I played against f4 where I've done poorly. I don't know. Maybe I've even had a classical game with f4 where I did poorly, and played some inferior sideline. I don't know. But I'm just gonna pretend like I don't know anything and just kind of try to figure this out from move one over the board myself. Like if somebody who wasn't Ivanchuk, just some random person played f4 against me, what would I do? And after some thought, I decided that the simplest, most responsible thing to do, probably, is to basically pretend we're playing the white side of a Dutch. So, if white plays d4 and black responds with f5, we're into the Dutch defense. There's a lot of aggressive ways for white to try to deal with this. There's gambits with f4, there's this idea bishop g5, but one of the very, very simple ways is just to continue with grabbing some space in the center, c4, let's say knight f6, knight c3, either e6 or g6. Black can kind of play either way, but in either case, white's basically just going to fianchetto, take control of this long diagonal, eventually play a move like e4, which exploits the fact that this pawn is a little bit overextended, and white has a pretty sizable advantage out of the opening, objectively speaking, in theory, and also it's a position that's very, very easy to play. So I decided that against f4, okay, we're going to be a tempo down if we play the reverse side of a Dutch defense, but the plan is pretty much going to be the same anyway, and the Dutch, at least the lines of the Dutch where white goes for a kind of more quiet approach, just developing the pieces, fianchettoing the bishop, and not going for the crazy gambit lines, don't tend to have a very high cost of a move. One tempo is not generally going to make or break the evaluation of the position. So that's a plan I decided to pursue, mostly because I figured, okay, it can't be that wrong. There's most likely no way that white is going to actively punish this plan. Maybe we get a slightly worse position. I don't know, but it's not going to be much worse than slightly worse, worst case. So let's just stick with that. Ivanchuk played knight f3, I played c5, e3, knight c6, bishop b5, and this is one of the first moments where we do see the relevance of the tempo. Now, black is not really in time to play g6 and bishop g7 immediately if we don't want to allow white to compromise the structure by taking on c6. I did spend a little bit of time here because I don't know, or I didn't know, and I still don't really know, to be honest. If we really care if white breaks the structure like this, it's probably fine for black. But I wanted to keep things as simple as possible. Just not allow any real imbalances that aren't necessary, because again, this is not an opening or a system for either side that I'm particularly familiar with. I don't play d4, I don't play the Dutch. I know that this approach is like reasonable against those sorts of structures, but I don't know any details. And especially I don't know the nuances of whether the extra tempo is going to matter. For example, after g6, takes, let's say castle, bishop g7, knight c3, just some normal moves. Now, there's a possibility, and I don't know if it's true, that because we're a tempo down, we actually have a lot of trouble defending this pawn if white goes for a very direct approach, sort of Nimzo-Indian style, just loading up on this pawn and going to collect it. Maybe if we're playing this from the white side, we have the opportunity to either load up and defend this pawn, or maybe we have the opportunity to strike back in the center with like e4 or something, but maybe from the black side we don't. And because of these sorts of questions in my mind where, okay, I could sit here for 15 minutes and try to calculate and decide maybe it's not dangerous that white takes, maybe it is dangerous that white takes. The much simpler approach, and probably the much more practical approach for a 90-30 game where you don't actually have a lot of time to invest into 15-minute long things, especially not a move 4 of a game, is just to go ahead and defend this knight so that we can take back without having to compromise our structure. It's a little passive, for sure, but it's also not like the craziest idea of all time. Again, if we compare it to some Nimzo-Indians or something from white, nowadays people are actually trying very, very slow, passive-looking moves like bishop d2 playing for a win. Now, it's not the same thing here because the pawn is not on f5, but the principle is, I think, reasonable to follow, where both sides, white in this case and in the game black, is saying, okay, you know, I'm going to invest some time, maybe a move or two, to just keep my structure intact. And you're going to have to either make use of that tempo or admit that, you know, this whole plan of giving away the two bishops or whatever just didn't really work out. My opponent played b3, and I decided to force the issue here with a6, either saying, okay, white needs to make a choice here. Either white is going to take on c6 and give away the bishop pair temporarily. The light square bishop probably will not survive forever. Or white needs to slide the bishop back, which basically means that we regain our quote-unquote lost tempo. You know, we're going to end up moving the bishop twice in the opening, most likely, but so is white, so it kind of evens out. White's argument would then be that, okay, at least I made you play a6, which is a waste of a move, but playing a6 isn't really that bad. You know, controlling the square is relevant, and sometimes preparing b5 is also certainly not going to hurt black. Most positions having either a6 or a3 for either side, even if it doesn't look like it does anything immediate, it usually has at least some purpose. So I would be pretty happy to see something like bishop e2. I think black would be perfectly fine. I would also be pretty happy to see takes, which is what my opponent played. And after takes knight e5, once again, the entire point of this operation is to make sure that we don't have to take back with the pawn. So the natural move is queen c7, just preparing to take back with the queen. Again, this sort of mimics the Nimzo-Indian line, where black does have the option of taking and playing knight e4, which sort of forces the bishop off directly, and white generally responds here with queen c2, which leads to a position that's more or less equal, but white's, I mean, it's still a game. There are plenty of pieces on the board. So after queen c7, we both continue developing for a little bit. Bishop b2, very natural. Knight f6, also very natural. d3. And now we continue the plan that we talked about at the beginning. It would be very, very natural to play e6 here, and there probably was a time where I would just autopilot e6. But if black does autopilot e6, I felt that this knight was actually very, very difficult to dislodge. For example, let's say knight d2, bishop d6, knight f3. Now this knight is very, very well placed. And this bishop is actually not particularly good on d6. It's not really, you know, visually it's well placed, but it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really contribute to any of black's pawn breaks. Like, you know, if we ever want to play d4, for example, this bishop is not particularly well placed to support it on d6. If we ever want to play knight d7 to try to evict this knight, the bishop having vacated the defense of this pawn is quite annoying. And so instead of e6, I decided to go for the plan we talked about at the beginning, which is g6, intending to fiend shadow the bishop, castle, and then we can pursue plans like knight d7 in a much more comfortable way, since the bishop on the long diagonal is quite relevant. It puts pressure on e5 indirectly, it supports knight d7, it sort of indirectly supports d4, potentially with tactics. For example, if we say like knight d2, bishop g7, knight f3, there are some things that can be considered with d4, probably not in this exact position, but there's some general ideas of like allowing takes, playing knight d5, hitting the f4 pawn, threatening to bring the knight into e3, and white needs to be a little bit careful about allowing this long diagonal to open, because this could expose a very annoying pin. So in general, I felt the bishop was very, very well placed on g7. My opponent did play knight d2, bishop g7, and then Ivanchuk went for queen to e2, which at the time I didn't fully understand the purpose of this move. To be honest, I'm still not sure. I thought during the game that maybe this was aimed at castling queenside, which in my mind during the game kind of made sense, because right now the trajectory of the game I think is very, 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 very stable for black. Black has a very clear plan of just castling, playing knight d7, trading off a couple of pieces, maybe playing f6 e5 to grab more of the center, and black is certainly not going to be worse in such a situation. So I figured that maybe my opponent is intending to castle queenside, not so much because castling queenside is all that good for white, I wasn't sure if it was, but just because it introduces at least some imbalance. You know, if we play castles queenside, knight d7, maybe, first of all, this bishop is defended, which is a little bit important. Maybe this does allow white to now do stuff like take on c6 and not be hanging the bishop on b2. And after some stuff, let's say, for example, knight c6, takes, maybe like g4 or something and trying to start an attack, at least there is some imbalance in the position. Is black supposed to be in trouble here? Probably not, but it's hard to tell. This is a position where both sides are going to be playing for an attack, and the question is who gets there first, which I thought maybe that was my opponent's idea, just saying, okay, I don't know, neither of us are going to know how to actually evaluate opposite side castling here, but in a way that, he's playing the white pieces, he heavily outmatches me, he's obviously going to be trying to keep chances alive. This is the sort of thing that at least introduces a complicated position, so I thought maybe that was the plan. I castled anyway, because what else? I mean, there isn't really a lot else to consider. And now, in hindsight, I think if my opponent castles queenside, it probably is actually just quite bad for white, to be honest. If we play knight d7, okay, sure, white can get the position that we just talked about, but we don't necessarily need to do that. We can play b5, we can play a5, we can start to consider crazy stuff like c4, not in this position, but after b5 we can start to consider stuff like c4. Our rooks are very, very well placed to slide over to the queen side, and even though the two bishops is not super relevant right now because this bishop is not immediately participating, it can be a very, very serious force later. I think this is probably a little bit easier for black to play. I was probably intending a5. The simple plan, of course, is to play a4, open up the a file to start some attack with. And if white plays a4, this is very, very weakening. Extends his queenside quite a bit. After b5, immediately challenging it. It's pretty clear that black is the one attacking, and white's attack is at least 3 moves back before he can sort of match the same level of firepower. So understandably, my opponent decided not to castle queenside, which I think would have been probably a little bit too much, or asking too much of the position. Yes, it's imbalanced, but you do need to do a little bit better than imbalanced a lot of the time. You can't just say, oh, it's imbalanced, that's good enough. It does have to be reasonable. My opponent instead decided to castle kingside, which is a little bit more sane, just keeping the position a little bit more stable. Now, of course, this does allow black to continue the simplification plan, trying to get rid of this very, very powerful knight. Knight d7 was played. My opponent did take on c6. I know I did say that castles queenside maybe allows white to take on c6 without hanging the bishop on b2. Here, of course, with knight d7 specifically, knight c6 is possible anyway, because if we do take on b2, then white is grabbing this pawn on e7 and then also this pawn on d5. When first of all, I don't think that we actually do get the exchange when I was looking at this position, because if we go queen d6, there's knight c4, forking the queen and the bishop, and then white emerges just up 2 pawns for not a whole lot. If we do go queen c6, maybe we do actually get it, but I did not like any of these positions at all. If white just plays like c4 or something, okay, we've won an exchange, but this knight is very, very powerful. White has 2 pawns for the rook, and there are no open files in the position to speak of to try to take advantage of with our rooks. So I don't remember if there was something even more specific. There might have been. For example, rook b1 here is probably even more direct, just taking on d5, but there's not really any reason to calculate any of this. It's very, very clear that white is going to be very happy if he's allowed to take on e7. So the only reasonable response is to take back with the queen, which I did. And after takes, we've reached now a very, very simplified position. There are very few pieces remaining on the board, just one set of minor pieces. And there is no structural weakness in black's position at all. We haven't been forced to take back with the pawn. We don't have any pawn weaknesses. None of these pawns are weaknesses. In fact, they're probably strengths. We do still have a very tight control over the center. And so at this point, I started to feel pretty confident. It's pretty clear, I think, at this point that black is equalized, or at least is not in any big trouble. And I was up, quite a bit of time on the clock now because my plan had been so simple. So I started to feel at this point that at least the opening had gone very well for me, and we can, we can sort of decide what we want to do from there. We have, this is not a dead position by any means. Black has plenty of nice available plans. Rook e8 and e5 was my main one, just trying to target this weak e3 pawn. We have ideas like b5 and c4, trying to expand on the queen side a little bit. There's plenty of stuff to play for. It's not like this position is dead. And I did think that at this moment, I thought that I honestly had like decent chances to start playing for advantage. My opponent in this position, though, did play e4, which I think sort of changed my mindset a little bit. Without e4, I was expecting a move like... For some reason, I didn't really consider this. I was mostly considering c4 during the game, and after takes, wasn't quite sure how white is going to take back. If taking with the b pawn, I think might look very natural, but this pawn configuration, I think, becomes very, very weak, and after something simple like rook d8, it's actually quite difficult to start holding all of these pawns together. There's also no real way to advance them with either e4 or d4, so this pawn structure is pretty fixed. I was expecting more either knight c4, which is not super pleasant because the knight gets kicked back kind of immediately, or more likely dc4, which keeps the d file open for white to work with as well. And then the question sort of becomes like, is this pawn on f4 a strength because it restricts the knight from coming to e5, or is it a weakness because it makes this backwards pawn? But while I was thinking about that, my opponent played e4 pretty immediately after I took back on c6. And at this point, I realized that, okay, white is not without ideas either. This supposedly weak pawn on e3 that we would be targeting with rook e8, e5, etc., trying to open up the e file and then put a lot of pressure, is now getting liquidated off pretty directly. So most likely black is equalized, but we still do need to prove one or two things before it's truly equal. But fortunately, it's not too hard to solve the problems here. I went ahead and took on e4, he took back with the pawn, and now I played what I think is probably a pretty important move, which is this move e5, not allowing white to expand further in the center. The other natural move would be something like rook d8, but if we allow white to play e5, now suddenly this pawn on f4 has an actual purpose. It's taking a lot of space in the center, supporting this e5 pawn, which is a pretty annoying dagger in black's position. This knight doesn't have a great route back into the game. We would love to have it on d5, but it's actually quite difficult to get there. For example, if we go knight b6, c4 takes control of this square somewhat permanently, which is very annoying. And more to the point, if we don't play e6, we have to worry about white playing e6 himself. We also have to worry about f5 and an attack against the king. But if we do play e6, then this knight is coming into a very, very powerful outpost on d6, which might not be fatal, but is very, very unpleasant to play against. So the only real move in my mind is playing this move e5, which looks a little bit scary because we are sort of opening up our king a little bit in a sense. We also give white the option of opening up the f-file if he wants to. For example, after takes, for example, something like queen e3 is the move I was looking at. This has an immediate threat of queen c3, which is, again, not fatal because we'll be able to play f6, but it is a little bit annoying. This also, the queen can come to an f-file, either for f4 or something, but I didn't think that this could realistically be super dangerous. I mean, even if we just play rook e8, white does have an isolated pawn that we've blockaded very, very well. Something like f6 does look weakening a little bit, but it doesn't really introduce any real holes into black's position. They're kind of all theoretical. And so I thought black should be quite happy here. This means that white basically has to play the move f5, which is what my opponent played. And this does look scary because, again, since we've had to play e5, we don't have the square for the knight available. We lose a little bit of control over f6. White has very, very clear plan of trying to play f6 himself, introducing a lot of holes on the dark squares, trying to get the queen in, threaten mate, lift the rook, like all of this sort of stuff. For example, if we allow f6, Obviously here we can take, but if we slid back for God knows what reason, then after queen e3, it's already very, very difficult to defend. I mean, okay, again, pretend we can't take on f6, because queen h6 is coming, threatening mate, rook f3, rook h3 is coming, threatening another mate. This is sort of white's vague idea. But it's very slow to actually accomplish that, because, we don't have to pretend that we can't take on f6. We can actually do that. That's legal. And so in order for white to do that, white needs to find a way to actually cement the pawn on f6, which is not easy at all. It might require a long setup plan like g4, g5, and only then f6, which is, a plan, but beyond being slow, it's also not the easiest for white to, or I guess it's not like jackpot if white actually even gets it. If, white's pawns were on g5 and f6 here, white would then need to go to some pretty heavy contortions to actually get the queen to h6. And even if it does, a configuration like the king on h8, rook on g8, knight on f8 actually does kind of defend all of the immediate mate threats. While in the meantime, we have our ideas of our own going down the d file with either the rook or the queen. So I didn't think that this attack could be super serious, something to be careful of course, but we should be fine with correct play. I played the move knight f6. This has a few purposes. One, of course, we're stopping f6 immediately from white. Not that it was a threat, but this sort of permanently puts the knight in the way. We're also putting pressure on the e4 pawn, which is now the sort of, once again, a backwards pawn in white's position. But when it was on e3, it was weak because with the pawn on f4, it was a backwards pawn. But with both pawns advancing forward one square, it is still a backwards pawn that we can start to go target. And so black's plan is very clear. We're going to play rook d8, rook d4, put pressure on e4, try to collect that. And if white does go g4 here, intending g5, trying to kick the knight, we're very happy to just play g5 and lock down the king side entirely. Even though this move often is not something you want to play, it looks a little bit weakening. Eventually white's going to be able to play f4. In this position, it's way too slow. I was looking at some lines here where white can try it, but for example, after h4, even if we go h6 takes, queen e3, yes, the pawn is threatened. No, we probably don't care. Worst case, for example, there's rook g8, and now after takes king f8, the pawn on g4 will fall, and it's actually white's king that's in a lot of trouble. There's probably other ways to do this as well. I was thinking about, okay, maybe we can play rook h8 with the idea of takes king f8, and now there's no immediate attack on g4, but there are some indirect ones. I mean, well, I guess actually, first of all, we are immediately threatening to take this pawn, because we'll have some tactic. For example, knight I guess knight f3 does defend it. Let's say like knight c4. We can actually take on g4, and if takes, we have rook g8, skewering the queen to the king, so that's no good. But if white does defend this, like, I don't know, let's say, well, actually not that easy to find a move to defend against it. Let's say knight f3, like we were saying, then black can even consider stuff like king e7, intending to bring the other rook into the game. Here, of course, there's stuff to calculate. I guess knight f3 we probably should just take, but in general, I think that it's actually black that's going to attack on the king side, if anybody. Just like white can play h4, we can play h5, and since the king has moved up, the rooks are a little bit more mobile over to the king side. So g4 I thought was just sort of out of the question. My opponent played rook e1, which I thought made a lot more sense. Just, first of all, activating the rook in a way that can slide over to the king side, for example, but also just shores up the e4 pawn, where it's now a little bit over-defended, and that, among other things, frees up the knight to move to either c4 or f3. I went ahead and played rook d8. We're just continuing our plan. I mean, again, no reason to really change. We're just going to putting pressure on e4. King h1 was played. I played the move rook e8. I remember during the game, I was thinking that I'm not really sure what to play here, to be honest. And rook e8 just seems like a sensible move to improve the position in general. The immediate point of rook e8, I think, is basically to defend the e5 pawn, so moves like knight f3 and knight c4 become far less appealing. But it's mostly, I mean, the real sort of psychological point of rook e8 is basically saying, okay, sure, you've brought your rook into the game, you've moved your king, congratulations. You do need to actually find a plan, though. And you're down a lot of time. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just going to respond to whatever it is you do. And if you want to overextend it, if you don't want to do anything, great. Maybe I won't do anything either. Maybe I will, but maybe I won't. But if you want to overextend your position, I'm perfectly happy to take advantage of that as well. I guess one concrete point of rook e8 is if we play like some random move, then after g4, now g5 is a little bit harder to accomplish because knight f3 would fork the two pawns. With rook e8, now g4, knight f3 comes with quite a lot less punch, since his pawn is defended, and we can just again play h6 like before. So I did play rook e8. This is maybe a moment where it was probably better to do something a little bit more concrete. I did consider rook d4, of course, trying to attack this pawn, but after c3, we're basically just coming back anyway. I did consider a move like rook d7, just trying to double on the d file, but again, we have some issues with this pawn. So overall, I thought rook e8 was probably reasonably sensible, but maybe this is a moment where things could have been improved. My opponent played queen e3, just trying to improve the position of the queen. I didn't think this was connected with any immediate idea, but it makes sense. And here is where I started an operation to just try to be annoying. We start with knight g4, putting the question is queen immediately. There aren't many squares that the queen can go to because it needs to maintain contact with the d2 knight. So, the only two squares to do that are either e2 or c3. My opponent repeated once, and I repeated again, just because why not? I didn't really expect my opponent to take a draw here. But if he did, obviously I'm not going to be too upset. It wasn't really clear to me what my plan was to win the game, even though I think my position was quite fine at this point. But the main point of this is basically to say, okay, like if you're going to go queen c3, now you are extending your position quite heavily. You're allowing rook d4 without playing c3, or without the option of playing c3, and so this pawn on e4 is going to come under pretty heavy fire. So I think that queen c3 is actually a bad move for you. I'm going to bait you into it by sort of weaponizing the threat of a perpetual. Like queen e2 is probably objectively a better move than queen c3, but I know you're not going to do that because you're trying to win. You're white and you have 300 rating points on me. But if you allow rook d4, like, okay, good luck. So I went ahead and played rook d4 because why not? Of course, my opponent did play queen c3, averted the repetition. I played rook d4, and my opponent played rook e2, just trying to shore up both the e-pawn. White is possibly intending to double rooks if we somehow generate even more pressure on this pawn. Like if we came back to f6, for example, I can consider rook to e1. But it also just defends the knight, which is considerably more important because it frees up this queen. Now the queen is not stuck to the knight anymore. So we renewed that problem for him by sliding our other rook to the d-file. We've now accomplished getting to double the rooks on the d-file, which is, I thought, a very, very big accomplishment. That's what we would have liked to do when we played rook e8, but again, there were problems with e5, so we had to take a little bit of a detour, but now there's no downside anymore. We just have the rooks, both rooks on the d-file, which is very comfortable. h3 was played, knight to f6, and here my opponent played knight to f3, instead of trying to passively defend the e4 pawn, which would be very difficult. If white did play rook e1 here, this is illegal, but not pleasant. We don't immediately have tactics with rook takes d2 because the e5 pawn will be hanging. But I thought simpler stuff with just like b5, starting to expand on the queen side, I thought black should probably be maybe not better, but quite a bit more comfortable. There's also knight h5, trying to invade on the dark squares. So knight f3 is an attempt to clarify the position a little bit more. Of course, we took on e4. This is where we did need to calculate a little bit. I did very much consider knight takes c4, which is more forcing. We do need to consider it because we have to check if it wins. But this is not like a terribly difficult calculation. I don't think this is really working out for black. Knight takes on d4. If we take the queen, then we enter a long series of exchanges where, yes, we do get the rook at the end, but we're just down a piece. That much is easy. And if we take on d4 and the queen just, arguing that the queen doesn't really have a good square because we have this issues with knight to g3, I don't think this is actually really true. White can just play queen f3, and there's not a whole lot for black. We can take on f5, and we do have 2 pawns for the exchange, but I had a hard time believing that this was that great for black. And of course we can't really take with the c pawn. Well, actually we can. This was a line that I was calculating, which is kind of important, because if white does take on c6, we have this very nice idea, this very nice intermediate move, knight g3, where either way the king goes, we're taking a check. For example, king g1, knight takes e2 is picking up a rook with check. King h2, knight takes f1 is also picking up a rook with check, and in either case this gives us time to collect the pawn back, and black will enter the rook endgame just up a pawn. So I was kind of excited when I saw this line, and I thought maybe my opponent just blundered knight e4. But after c takes d4, I slowly realized that once again, white can just play the move queen f3, and once we take back on f5, this is a better version probably, because the pawn structure is intact, but it's probably still not enough for black to actually be better or even okay here. There is not the move g4, which would win on the spot otherwise, because again we have this very nice trick with knight g3, but after a very simple move like king h2, I didn't see how to progress. These pawns are quite weak in a way that's very, very difficult to defend, and our tactical checks with knight g3 are pretty much gone, so I thought that this was just collapsing. So if we can't take on e4 with the knight, the only other option is to take with the rook, which I played. My opponent played knight takes e5, and queen d5 is pretty much the only reasonable move, I thought. And at this point, I thought I was once again feeling confident, because it looks like white has considerably overextended. If white goes ahead and takes on e4, then we can take back with the knight, and now we are hitting the queen, we're hitting the knight, and we're threatening the idea of knight g3. White can't really defend against all of these. To keep the knight defended, white would have to go back to either b2 or a1, which would allow knight g3. So white is unable to take, but we are also attacking the knight, so the rook can't just like move away to f2 or something. This means that white's pretty much only move, I thought, was to play rook e1, which my opponent did, and more interestingly, at this moment, accompanied the move rook e1 with a draw offer. Now, this puts me in an interesting situation, where it looks like visually, to me, black is clearly better. White is very clearly overextended, but it doesn't look like it's winning. I spent quite some time trying to find like an actual win here, but I couldn't find one, and I'll go into some of the lines I was looking at in a second. But also, my opponent has basically no time. He's on increment now. We have 30 minutes. And so I had to think like, okay, I've been offered a draw by one of the biggest legends of the last century, arguably probably like top 3, maybe 5, whatever, but it's one of the top legends of the last century with the black pieces. My opponent, he's still 2600. Maybe he's past his prime, but he's still a very, very, very good player. I have the option here of just taking a half point. Drawing Ivanchuk with black would be a fantastic result for me. For anybody, probably, but especially for me. There's very much a bird in the hand situation. But on the other hand, would I respect myself if I took a draw offer in this position, where it's a position where I think it's very, very clear the black is better. Even if we didn't do anything fancy, black cannot ever be worse. Like it's basically impossible. So do I play this on? Do I try to win this position? And eventually, probably against better judgment, I decided to try to win this position. I went ahead and took here. So I guess there are a couple lines that are interesting. I was mostly trying to make the move rook e8 work, because it looks like rook e8 should just win. We're attacking this knight. The knight can't move because we're also sort of introducing a pin. And if white does take on e4, Then we take back with the knight, and white is having all the same problems as before. The queen is under attack, the knight g3 is being threatened, the knight is under attack, everything is apparently falling apart for white. The move that I couldn't figure out here, which I'm going to have to remember what my issue was with this. Oh, I guess one thing that's important here is that knight g4, which is a move that I was looking at, I think, I don't think I actually checked this with the computer, but in the game I thought that this was no good. This looks very scary because white is exploiting a very, very dangerous pin on the long diagonal, but I think white can actually get away with taking. Or, no, okay, I'm thinking of a different position. Here, black cannot get away with taking, probably, because of takes and queen h8. Okay, ignore that. Pretend I didn't say that. So maybe that was what I was scared of, was immediate knight g4. That makes sense. So I was going to say, okay, so the thing that I was trying to play, which I think, or I thought initially should be winning on the spot, was trading and then rook e8. This makes more sense. Now black is threatening knight e4. Again, sort of all of these threats, and it doesn't look like white has a good way to defend against all of them. Now knight g4 would look scary, but I think black can get away with taking, because after queen takes f6, king f8, there are actually no more checks. We don't go to g8, because that would allow knight h6, which might actually also be okay. But after king f8, if white continues giving checks, then we just slide out to e7, and now there's pretty much nothing left. And if white takes with the knight, then we are immediately ending the game by giving check, forcing the king to h2, and picking up this knight in the process. So knight g4 is not really a problem. The move that I was very, very concerned about, though, was a very odd-looking move, queen to a1, which I just could not refute, and I was very annoyed that I couldn't refute it. This sort of steps out of the way of knight to e4. Now, if we do play knight e4, the knight can move somewhere with check. It doesn't just steps out of all of the problems. And after we defend against this check, probably with f6, then a simple move like king h2 is probably okay, just defending the g3 square. Maybe, yeah, I guess king h2 is fine. I was gonna say maybe we're allowing queen d6, but just going back to g1 is fine. And if we don't play knight e4, then white is going to untangle next move by playing queen e1, which resolves the pin on the e-file and just sliding the knight back somewhere, after which white should not really have problems anymore either. After queen a1, I don't know if, I actually haven't checked. I should probably check if queen a1 was really, this was a move I couldn't refute. I guess I probably should have, I did think about taking, and then after queen e1 I figured, okay, probably white is not much worse. Maybe I underestimated this, and maybe this is quite a big deal for white still. This pawn is still a very, very healthy pawn, but as we'll see later in the game, that was something that I failed to appreciate, sort of on multiple circumstances. But I went ahead and took on e2, and after takes, instead of rook e8, which I spent actually quite a lot of time trying to make work, I instead decided to go with the simpler approach of knight to e4. We are again threatening sort of everything, and part of the reason that I went for this move was I thought that the move queen f3 was losing, to something that we'll see in a moment. So I thought that in this position white had to play, what did I think white had to play? I don't actually remember. I'm going to cheat a little bit. Oh yeah, okay, I thought that he had to take here and play knight c6, and then this endgame should be good for black. I mean, we're going to be up a pawn and a queen in game. The queen has to move somewhere. Probably to, like, actually, I wasn't quite sure where. I was thinking about, like, d2, for example, just maintaining contact with this pawn. And after takes, black is up a very, very comfortable pawn. So I thought that this was forced, but unpleasant for white. Because after queen f3, which my opponent played very quickly, and here I thought that he blundered in time pressure. I thought that this was blundering a very nice idea, which I ended up playing, and in sort of frustration, let's say, I realized it wasn't quite working. Which was this point that now knight d2 is attacking the queen, so we can play queen d1, force the king to h2, and then play knight to d2, intending to sort of a fork, basically. We're attacking the queen, and we're threatening knight f1, which should be a very, very deadly threat. What I realized in my calculation after my opponent played queen f3 here, whoops, jumped a little bit ahead, is that the knight coming to d2 is not actually the end of the story. White can take on b7 and start to generate counter threats of his own, because after knight f1, for example, king g1, knight g3, knight e3, wherever. Yes, white is going to lose some material, but there's going to be a lot of counterplay against black's king. So I spent a lot of time calculating this, and I decided that, okay, well, after knight g3, if white goes king h2, which of course he won't, he would go to f2, but if white goes king h2, we can play knight takes e2, which is threatening mate. And after queen takes f7, we can actually kind of escape a little bit. After king h6, it looks like, we're really walking into the fire. But after knight g4, king g5, there aren't really any checks left. If white goes king f6 or queen f6, we go to h5, and now the king is somehow completely safe. If white goes to e7, then I think we're not taking on f5 because there's mate. We're not going to f4 because there's mate. What was the idea here? Good question. Maybe this is perpetual, actually. h5 takes here. This back. Maybe this was one of the lines that I saw was ending in perpetual. I thought there was a line, I'm pretty sure. Oh, okay, I was thinking about knight e3, which is another way to try to play. So of course white would go king f2, but if king h2, when we take here, we're now sort of threatening, I guess not mate because it's defended, but basically mate, liquidating everything. And now with this idea, there's no knight g4. This is the point of knight e3, is to try to stop knight g4. So there would actually be no checks here, and despite how scary it looks, black is actually kind of okay. So I saw some big ideas like this, and I thought, okay, well, worst case we have perpetual, right? Like, if white does go here, king h2, we can take with the queen. This was the other line I was looking at, not the knight, even though that was starting mate. Then white would have perpetual. But now the point is that after takes king h6, knight g4, king g5. Once again, if queen f6, the king is safe, so we can... The line doesn't even end here because black doesn't have an immediate threat, so white can play some slow move, and we actually have to be a little bit careful. But the main point here is that queen e7 is not possible because the queen on e2 is covering it. So after knight g3, white can't play king f2 because we would take and take on e5. So he would be forced to enter this line. This would all be pretty required. But of course, white has the ability to improve on this line at the beginning by starting with the move f6. Now it's too early for us to be moving the king out into the fire. Here we would just basically get mated, probably in any number of ways. I guess knight g4 is the simplest. So after f6, we'd have to go back to probably g8 or something. h8 would allow taking with checks, so probably king g8. And now after queen takes b7, we don't really have anything better than just sort of making a perpetual of our own. Knight f1, king g1, knight g3. Once again, king f2 is not possible. We'll just take and take on e5. Well, once he goes back, we can make our own perpetual. But I also thought that, well, yes, we can make our own perpetual, but we might also be able to play rook f8 and just defend mate and, argue, okay, white's king is kind of in a bit of a mess. Maybe knight g3 first and then rook f8 is also possible. It sort of keeps the situation complicated. So I thought, okay, back from this position, yes, queen d1, knight d2 probably isn't winning. like I initially thought it was, but it's confusing. It makes white. It's going to make white calculate some pretty complicated lines because it's very easy to just assume that queen b7, queen f7 is mate, and not really calculate the king running, especially when you don't really have the time to calculate the full line. And if my opponent finds a way to force me to take perpetual, like fine, what am I really losing? The alternative in this position, which I didn't really fully consider to be honest, is actually just take on f5. White can't take back because we have knight g3. So we are winning just a pawn. It's not a very healthy pawn, but it is a pawn. I honestly didn't consider this move very much at all. Mostly because I just kind of assumed after knight c4, knight e3, white is going to collect the pawn back, and there's no reason that this should be a bad transformation at all. So I thought that, this is nothing serious. In hindsight, I think the main thing I missed here is that we sort of have the same trick. Once white plays knight e3, he's not actually going to be able to take on f5 because, again, there's going to be knight g3 issues. So we can actually preserve this pawn very heavily, where after b5, knight e3, queen e5, once again, white cannot take because we have this very typical trick, just grabbing the piece off the board and playing knight g3 on our own. White, of course, won't take. White will take on e4 instead. But after takes, rook d2, this is maybe not winning, but we probably will end up winning a pawn and having some serious chances. I mean, realistically, I think white would probably survive, but it's definitely a better try than what I did. We can, of course, also, if we're content with making the draw at this point, we can just take on e5 and everything comes off, and technically we're up a pawn going into the rook endgame, but it's not serious, and we just make a draw. But I went ahead and played queen d1, and after knight d2, my opponent sort of shocked me by playing queen f2, which did not occur to me at all. I did not realize at all that this move was possible throughout my entire calculation. As soon as we got to knight d2, as I was physically playing knight d2, I was like, wait a second, like, can he play queen f2? Like, what happens then? But unfortunately, it's a bit too late, and at this point, now black is actually almost losing, which is kind of surprising. Even though I guess it's kind of clear that white has escaped the main danger, because now after knight f1, knight g3, and so on, there's rook e1, which defends the entire back rank. So we're not really checkmating white anymore, and if we're not checkmating white, it's not really clear why black should be better. But I wasn't really expecting, even in this position, that there was going to be too much danger. I thought, okay, sure, we messed it up a little bit, not great, but we're probably not lost. Apparently we almost are already. I played check, king g1, and apparently the main blunder here is knight g3, which I thought was a very natural move, but is apparently bad. I think the computer pointed out, I forget exactly what it pointed out, but I think it thinks that the only way to hold this position is to play knight e3. And after rook e1, go ahead, take, play rook d1, trade everything off, and this position is barely holding. White is going to be a little bit faster in with his king, but after takes, very important that we play f takes, which gives our king a route back into the game, and black is still surviving. But even here, I didn't appreciate the danger. I thought knight g3 shouldn't be that big a deal. After rook e1, queen d4, I expected white to play f6, after which we just slide back, we trade off the queens, and this pawn is probably weak enough that everything is going to be fine. But my opponent, at this point, came up with an idea that I had not looked at all, which was to just take on g6, and at this point, I realized that we're in some very, very serious trouble. We would like to probably take on g6 with the pawn, but I couldn't find a way to justify this sort of pawn sacrifice after just takes on f7. Maybe this was actually a better try after trade everything. Rook d2, this at least forces white to play something like rook f1, rook f2, but it looks like a very healthy extra pawn for white. So I decided I had to take back with the f-pawn, which maybe that was a mistake, maybe not, I'm not entirely sure. And this overlooked, again, white's next move as well, which was not to trade the queens in a way that would help black sort of reactivate the pieces. but instead to force the exchange on his terms, where now after trading the queens, White's king is very, very active, White's rook is going to be first into the game, this knight doesn't have a very comfortable home, and the rest of this is pretty much just a pretty clean mop-up. Struggled on for a little bit, but we're both playing on increment, and I think there were probably slightly better defensive attempts along the way, but nothing particularly serious. My opponent found one of many ways to complete the game, and after the rook gets behind the pawn, it's clear there's nothing to play for, and we ended up losing. So, obviously a very, very disappointing result in a position where, you know, not only were we offered a draw, but we had many opportunities in the next several moves to force a draw if we wanted to. And then even when it got bad, you know, we still had opportunities to save the draw. There was really no reason to lose this game. Honestly, what I think it boiled down to was just kind of overestimating this position on general grounds. I didn't see any concrete reason that it should be winning, especially after we found this Queen A1 move, which somehow is very, very annoying. I think that once I saw this, I think this should have probably been a signal to me that the position is not as good as I thought. This should be a position where, like, either black is winning immediately or white is fine, of course. And if this is by far the most immediate attempt. So if the most immediate attempt is not working, we're really asking too much for the position to sort of get a second opportunity. And so yes, technically we sort of have one with GF, and black should have some decent winning chances, but I think it probably would have been a much more responsible decision to just not go crazy and accept what the position was telling us, which is that yes, we can push his position to the limit, but if we're not going to be perfect, like we're very much walking a tightrope here. If we're perfect, we can get to a somewhat better endgame. But if we're not perfect, we're actually going to get ourselves in trouble. And it's a second part of that I didn't fully appreciate until it was too late. So, disappointing result. I mean, still a very fun game to play. Like I said at the beginning, it's a very, very surreal experience getting to play against these types of players that you grow up studying, you grow up idolizing. I said I shouldn't use that word, but for Ivanchuk, I think that is a very appropriate word. It was a very, very fun experience to get to sit across the board from him, and it was definitely a fun experience to be in the position where I was able to turn down a draw, even if that was probably ended up being a bit of a bad decision. I was very, very upset after this game, though, because this was a very, very big missed opportunity, and especially on this being I think this was the first game of the day. Of a double round day. That's a lot to try to recover from before a second round of before an evening round. So I will maybe that'll be a bit of a pre-excuse for the quality of play in the next game, which we'll see shortly. But in the meantime, not a whole lot else to say. I think even now recapping it, it still stings quite a lot, to be honest. I don't usually get upset about single game results anymore. It's just part of it's just a thing that happens at this point. Like, you blow winning positions, it's fine. You fail to save like drawable positions, it's fine. You blunder in one move, like it's fine. Like it's just part of the game. But something about the circumstances here make it sting all the much more. The opponent, this sort of situation, the fact that obviously we've traveled a very long way to play this sort of game, it all kind of hurts a little bit more than a single game really has any right to. But focusing on the positives, I mean, we played a pretty good game overall by my standards. You know, I expected to just kind of get killed, and we at least put up some resistance, which was good. So I tried to focus on that and take that into round 3 at least, which we will see next time. So, you know, you try to take that away as well. We'll focus on some of the positives, whatever little ones remain. And I will see you all for round 3. Thank you for watching this interesting but slightly tragic game. See you next time.